Welcome to Early Immigrants in Oregon. And this has been brought to you by the World Beat folks, right? Yes. And we have three distinguished speakers today. Dr. Pritam Rohila, Joanna Ogden, and Steve Williamson, all of whom are experts on, right? Okay,
Ish.
you're an expert?
I don't know. We are experts.
Ish.
Experts.
All right, so we will begin first with Dr. Rohila.
Thank you.
Would you like to take my place?
Okay.
Because we're instructed to speak into the microphone.
Okay. I guess the order has been determined by age before beauty. I just turned 84 recently.
Yay.
So,
Good job.
thank you. I guess in deference to my age, I'm being allowed to go first. The picture here that you see is from 1913. On June 23rd, 1913. This is a ship named SS Minnesota. It's in the port of Seattle, Washington. And you can see some Indians on the deck of that ship. This picture was taken from the Washington State Historical Society in Tacoma. Okay, these are the kind of questions that I'm going to address today in my presentation. And I have taken my information mostly from the enumeration sheets of the US censuses of 1910, 1920, and 1930. And I've supplemented the information from that information with death certificates and also from some records from Oregon State Hospital, Oregon State Penitentiary, and U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service. And these are the publications I have referred to in my presentation today. And I also received some help from these distinguished people, including Professor Steve Williamson of the University of Oregon.
I appreciate being elevated to professor, but I actually had a courtesy appointment as a visiting scholar at the university.
Well,
not
okay,
a professor. But I
okay,
do
okay,
appreciate
visiting
the
scholar.
elevation, but
Okay. At that time, in the census of 1910, 20, and 30, there were 430 Indians in Oregon. I was able to locate 285 of them. That's 66% of the total number. My strategy, there's a huge record in those enumeration sheets. So I adopted a strategy. I knew that some 6 were there, so I used this. And they, fortunately, in those days, 6 and many Indians did not use their caste group. Okay, they did not have last name like I have Rohila. Just Pritam Kumar would be enough. Okay, so I used Singh as the strategy and got most of them. But I was also able to find some Hindus and Muslims too. But I was able to locate only 285 of them, just 66% of the total group. So in my sample, I had mostly 6, 88%, and in other studies also, that's fairly representative. Other studies have found similar information that mostly who came here from India were 6. probably because they were more adventurous than other people. And most of them were between the age of 21 and 60. And as we know, the younger the people are, more adventurous, more enterprising. And all of them were male except one, only one female, and I'll tell you later on about that female. And most of them were single, 62% of them. 1/3 of them were married, but they had left their wives back home, except only one person that I'll tell you later on. There was, in 1930 census, one interracial marriage. Mr. Paul Singh was married to Melissa from Minnesota, who was living in this area at that time. This picture has been used by other people too. This is a lady in the center that I'm talking about. Her name is Ratan. Ratan was her name, and she was married to the man Bakshish Singh Dillon. Dillon is the last name, which is unusual for that time, and their 4 sons. There are 2 or 3 guests behind them. I cut them off in my picture. This Bakshish Singh Dillon has enlisted in his teen years as merchant seaman, and then he also served in the military, British Indian Army. They had Indians serve in their British colonies of Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And he had been to all of those places. He first came to the United States in 1890, but did not bring his family till his third and last trip to India. That was in 1910. And they first settled in California. They had 4 children there. And then in 1916, they moved to Astoria, Oregon. And they were here. And like other Indians at that time, he also worked at the Hammond Lumber Mill in Astoria, which few years later burnt to ashes. He was conversant with English as well as Punjabi. And so he was a go-between the mill and the Indian workers. So there was any discussion, he could go back and forth between the two. Here is a picture of their 4 sons. Much later, picture was taken much later in life. All the children except the one sitting in the middle, Kapoor, had served in the military. The youngest one, who was standing, Hari, he died during the World War II in Okinawa. Now, people from India started coming to United States in 1820, but the average rate of arrival was only about 8, and mostly they were Europeans, British and Europeans who were in India at that time. Indians themselves did not start coming here till about 1902, and after that, their number, yearly arrival of their started increasing steadily. Most of them came between 1906 and 1911, and I'll tell you later why they came here. In Astoria area, 75% of them had come between these 2 years, 1906 to 1911. Um, and after 1911, there was a steady decline, not only in Oregon but elsewhere in the western United States also. The reason probably for that was the U.S. immigration policy. In 1917, United States had passed Immigration Act, which they declared a Pacific barred zone, that anybody from that area could not become a citizen of United States. And that was aimed at Japan, but ended up also affecting India. And then 1924, they said the people who are not eligible to become citizen, they cannot also enter the United States. So because of these two acts, there were no further migration of Indians for quite a while. Now, what kind of work they did? Most of them, 90% of them work in lumber mill. In the picture here, these are workers sitting in front of the Hammond lumber mill in Astoria. Some of them, just a few, 6% of them, work for the railroad. In southern Oregon, they were laying the railroad track for the first time for the Pacific and Eastern Railways Company in 1909, and there are some Indians working on this group. But there was only a small number of them. In Astoria lumber mill, they worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. And they earned $1.75 a day, $1.75 a day. At that time, if people, those who are familiar with history know, there was an Asiatic Exclusion League. They were agitating against the immigration to the United States of all Asians. Okay? And because of their agitation in Astoria, their wages were reduced in 1909 to $1.60 a day. Indians went on a strike. Because of the strike, their condition safety was improved, work day was reduced, but there was no increase in their wages. In Oregon, they lived mostly in 6 counties. They were Clatsop, Columbia, Jackson, Lynn, Marion, and Multnomah counties. But 78% of them lived in Multnomah and Clatsop counties. In Astoria, they lived in a block of 12 bunk houses, in 4 men to each bunk house, and they paid $1 a month for rent. These bunk houses were located, or this settlement was located outside the city limits, as elsewhere too, all Asians had separate settlements outside city limits, wherever they lived. And the locals called it Hindu Alley. By the way, at that time, even the U.S. officials called every Indian a Hindu, regardless of their religion. Even in the census, many of them are identified as Hindu. Indians were big and tall. Some of them were as tall as 6 foot 3 inches. So local people were afraid of them. They were also curious about their turbans. They had not seen the turbans. They would wonder what's under their turbans. So they will throw rocks or snowballs at their turbans to knock them off to see what's under the turbans. Sometimes locals had would fight with them, challenge them to fight, and eventually Sikhs, the Indians, ended up giving them wrestling lessons in the wrestling lessons there. One of the Indians identified himself as a professional wrestler. In this application, he sent to the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, declaring that he wanted to become a citizen of USA. And here he says that he's a wrestler. Where in India did they come from? They came from the farming area of central Punjab. At that time, Pakistan had not been created. So some areas were in Pakistan and some from current India. These are the Sialkot, Lahore, Amritsar, Hoshiarpur, Firozpur, Jalandhar and Ludhiana districts of central Punjab. If you know, the reason Punjab is called Punjab, because there are 5 big rivers running through the state. Ab in Persian means water and river. Panj means 5. So there are 5 big rivers running through there. And that's a very rich in farming area has been for ages. That's why it was considered to be golden basket, that and Indo-Gangetic plain at some time. Why did they come here? There are 2 factors. Nature played a role. In 1899 and 1900, the summer monsoons failed. There were extensive crop failures, which led to famines. But 1 to 4 million Indians starved to death all over India, including Punjab. And millions of cattle also died of starvation because of lack of water. And therefore, some Indians decided to do something different. Also, British government did not do anything to help those Indians at that time. Even when they had some grain stocks, they did not help people stricken by the famines. Also, in Punjab, they dug canals, started digging canals in 1880, linking these rivers from one to the other, and then opening up more areas for irrigation. Their purpose was not to help the Indians, but to be able to get more land revenue. But what they did was they did not allow full ownership of those lands that were just opened up there. And then they prohibited certain castes from owning the land or possessing the land. So because of those reasons, and also they levied steep water rates and land revenues, and many people ended up quitting farming and looking for some other kind of work. So what they did was many of them enlisted in the British Indian Army, and they served in the British Army, for example, during the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1898 through 1900. during that period, the Indian Army was sent there. 14th Sikh Regiment was sent there to control that rebellion. And so many of these people had served there. And after that was over, people took jobs as security guards and people jobs like that in Shanghai, Singapore, and Hong Kong. So having been exposed to better work opportunities in these areas, they were looking for something better someplace else. Around the same time, in Canada, Trans-Canada Railroad was being built. And the contractors working on those railroads, as well as shipping companies, were advertising heavily in India and elsewhere for better paying jobs in USA and Canada. So when these Indians who were earning 30 cents a day in Asia heard of these jobs paying $2 to $2.59 a day, it was a very attractive proposition. So those factors were the ones that made them decide to move here. I would, but around 1930s, the Indians from Oregon started disappearing. They started moving to California. In 1910, there were 305 Indians. In 1930, there were only 35 Indians left here. They moved to California. What were the reasons? One was the climate. They were not used to this damp, cold climate of Oregon. California climate was closer to what they were used to in India. Also, they had opportunity to work, get similar kind of farming work they were used to. In California in 1913, the state had passed a law that people who are not eligible for citizenship, they could not buy land or lease land for long periods of time. It was aimed at the Japanese, but it also affected the Koreans and the Chinese and Indians. But Indians, what they did was, sneaky Indians, what they did was they married Spanish women in Central California, University area. And through those Spanish women, their wives, they were able to buy land and return to farming. And the third reason was community. There were 5,000 Indians living in western United States at that time, and most of them were in California. And the fourth reason was the only Sikh temple in the western United States was located in Stockton, California, that they had started building in 1912. Religion is very important to Sikhs, and they go to temple for many reasons. So now I come to my last thing, that there was discrimination against all people coming from outside. Against Indians, it was more direct and more severe in early 1900s than it was after 1960s, when more educated, more professional people started coming in. Discrimination still stayed there, but it was more subtle. But the discrimination against this outsider is probably a universal phenomenon. Especially people, strangers who look different, talk different, behave different, they are not very well easily accepted by many people around the world. In India also, Indians don't like the Bangladeshis, for example, although they were at one time part of India. And I leave you with this poem by Rudyard Kipling called The Stranger. The stranger within my gate, he may be true or kind, but he does not talk my talk. I cannot feel his mind. I see the face and the eyes and the mouth, but not the soul behind. The men of my own stock, they may do ill or well, but they tell the lies I wanted to. They are used to the lies I tell, and we do not need interpreters when we do go to buy and sell. The stranger within my gates, he may be evil or good, but I cannot tell what powers control, what reasons sway his mood, nor when the gods of his far-off land shall repossess his blood. The men of my own stock, bitter, bad they may be, but at least they hear the things I hear. They and see the things I see. And whatever I think of them and their likes, they think of the likes of me. This was my father's belief, and this is also mine. Let the corn be all one sheaf, and the grapes be all one wine. Each ere our children's teeth are set on the edge by bitter bread or wine. Thank you.
We're going to make,
Questions now, leader?
we'll take questions after all three people, okay?
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Rohila. Dr. Rohila is a retired neuropsychologist, and he is a lifelong learner and study peacemaker. And he's traveled to Pakistan and India and organized peace camps with the young people of both of these countries. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much. Okay, and again, if you could hold your questions until everyone has spoken. All right. Now, our second speaker is Joanna Ogden. Are you going to want to come up here? Okay, all right, good. Okay, Joanna is an independent historian who is based in Portland. She's written extensively on the subject of Indian immigrants in Oregon. And she has, her articles can be found in the 2012 issue of Oregon Historical Quarterly, and has a new article coming out in the December 2019 issue, and has a book coming out in 2020. Yes. Correct? Okay, so Joanna Ogden.
That book plug is to keep me honest, I think. So how do I get to mine, Steve?
Oh, I'm sorry.
So thank you all for coming, and thank you for organizing this, Kathleen, to my co-panelists, and there's always something better to do on a Saturday, so I really appreciate coming out to this. So my job today is to go more at the 20,000-foot level. I think there's going to be some interesting overlap between the three of us. And some of this I'm going to sort of skip through kind of fast, and it's kind of big sweep historical stuff. And I'm happy if people have questions to take them up afterwards. So let me get that. So what I want to focus on is basically how and why people came to Oregon. Pratam talked about the situation in India. I want to talk about it more in terms of North American politics. And the second thing I want to talk about is the small community and the sort of monumental challenges to colonized citizenship that came out of Oregon. One was Gother and one was Bhagat Singh Thind. I also just want to sort of pose a couple of background questions for consideration. First being why many of us don't know about this history. Most of us, I certainly knew nothing about it until I sort of fell into this. And secondly, I want to sort of pose up the question of, I find this whole story of Indians in Oregon fascinating, but my deeper interest is what I've learned from this in regard and how it helps navigate the current problematic times that we're in about immigration and how it's been treated over the years. I found it really disheartening and useful both. So as Pritam talked about, Indians started coming in Oregon in any significant numbers around 1905, 1906. And they became more of a community after 1907. And I think there are two big reasons for that. One of them is the Western violence that broke out all across the West Coast, from the California-Mexican border up to, British Columbia. The first big one directed at Indians was in Bellingham, Washington, where basically 200 Hindustani or Indian workers were driven out of town by mob violence, and I'm talking real violence here. After that event, it sort of cascaded through the state with various smaller events. And a week later, in September of 1907, Canada had the largest riot. I think it remains the largest riot in its history. It was like 10,000 people. And in its wake, most of it was directed at Japanese and Chinese, but the measures that the Canadian and British colonial government took after that riot was squarely directed at Indian immigrants. Those measures essentially stopped Indian immigration to Canada, which is part of what spurred migration into the U.S. It also stirred, understandably, a lot of anger in the Indian community. This is some of the attitude. But the anger was certainly about the violence, but it wasn't just about the violence. It was about being lied to. The British colonists had promised Indians that they were equal members of the empire and that they were protected members of the empire, free to inhabit the many lands of the colonial empire. Yet here they were attacked by mobs when they were in Canada, which was an English dominion, and then they were abandoned and attacked by the British authorities. So a lot of the anger was about realizing that their actual status was, despite all the promises that the British had made to them. The other thing I want to talk about is that while laborers were involved in these struggles, in the riots, it wasn't just laborers. I think that's a misconception. There were a lot of middle-class people involved. There were doctors, there were teachers, there were ministers that were a part of this violence. And in terms of the laborers that were involved, I think we can get a little too quick and easy and just say it was about economic competition. Certainly that was a part of it. It was an explicit part of it in Bellingham. But as Pritam talked about some, wages in Oregon, for example, were pretty equivalent to whites who were in similar positions. So more than just simple economic competition, it was about this dense confluence of the politics of economic, race, and labor that sort of took place across the globe. And one of the things I liked about some of the articles that I found is that Indians rarely crossed picket lines, for example. Once they understood what was going on, they weren't used as strike breakers. White workers were not as good as informing people about what the terms of this were and letting them know, however. So part of how these politics played out amongst white laborers is it often came in the words of white laborers using this thing about being free labor versus so-called Indian coolies or contract laborers. Indians in North America were not coolies and they were not contract laborers. But those words were basically dog whistle terms to sort of talk about these were inferior people that were supposed to inhabit a demeaned position within the global colonial labor system. I keep using the wrong thing, sorry. So the problem is there are all these promises circulating in the world, and there are all these needs circulating in the world. India needed people to migrate out of India because of the unrest that was going on in India. North American industrialists needed gazillions of laborers coming in because this was the time of massive industrial growth. Indians had been promised equal standing, and at the same time, white workers had been promised the right of first place. So combined, this created this really complicated stew of frictions and animosities that unfolded globally, regionally, and locally, and shaped the Indian community, including its resistance. So when we talk about the Indian community, and especially their resistance, it never stands in one register. It's global, it's national, it's regional, and it's local all at once. And I think if we don't look at it that way, you know, the community and what they accomplished is basically indecipherable. But returning to 1907 and its aftermath, it's in the wake of that that Indian immigrants, they were understandably looking for some peace and a secure job. And for a hot minute, Oregon gave them that. But it wasn't as if there wasn't any violence in Oregon in 1907. Harnam Singh was basically executed in Boring, Oregon on Halloween night. And I don't want to diminish the importance of this murder, but I want to talk about it was a singular attack. It wasn't a whole city rioting against an entire population. So that's one point that's different. The second is, despite these massive acts of violence that had happened all across the West Coast in 1907, again, 10,000 people in British Columbia, Boring murder was the only one that was prosecuted that year, the only one. So in an odd way, a murder and its prosecution became an attraction, perhaps, to Indian workers coming to Oregon. So the reason that this prosecution happened was leaders in Portland basically had developed a distinct racial policy than the rest of the West Coast. Essentially beginning with the Chinese, these men figured out that the Chinese driven out of California could be lured and basically enticed to stay in Oregon, which Oregon really needed laborers, if Oregon leaders could sort of promise and ensure labor peace, that they wouldn't be attacked. So these powerful men used their positions, the editorial board of the Oregonian, their positions as judges and police, to enforce this policy, and they were largely successful. One of the immediate outcomes was the Chinatown, which, you know, the Chinese community in Portland, Oregon became one of the largest in the West Coast. It was second only to San Francisco in both numbers and in influence and power. And it was largely populated by people that were driven out by violence in cities like Tacoma, Seattle, California, etc. So I also want to be clear that this was not a policy, the Oregon racial policy was not one based in a sense of equality. It was based in ensuring a labor force for Oregon. And so these men that enforce this, these powerful men that enforce this, still adhere to, these are excerpts from the Oregon Constitution. You know, but what they were looking for is what was best to help grow Oregon. So this policy got extended to workers that came after the Chinese, which included the Indians. Okay, so the second major factor I want to talk about in terms of part of what drew Indians into Oregon was the 1905 Lewis and Clark Fair, which has a humongously long name, but that's how it's popularly known. This fair was aimed at building Portland into a Western powerhouse and propelling it into the 20th century. And the fair was hugely successful in this regard. There's been no greater period of growth in Oregon until present times than what happened in the wake of that fair. The population basically doubled, industries expanded, and whole new industries came online. And Indians were part of the thousands that moved into the state to live and work. The fair also provided an object lesson in the racial hierarchy of the times. For the 1.5 million visitors that came through, one of the things they saw was a live display of the recently colonized Filipino people. So I don't want to stay on that slide too long. So this is the complicated situation that Indians entered into in Oregon, that they are wanted as laborers, but they are basically reviled as people. So again, as Pratam talked about, two of the big population centers were in the St. John's Linton area and also Astoria. But a whole community developed from the Dalles all the way down to Astoria. And it was concentrated along the Columbia River. As Pratam said, they were men, they were laborers, mostly in lumber mills, that used the Columbia River as its highway to the world. What the community looked like in Oregon was very different than California and British Columbia. Here, people did not build temples. They largely, I found, maybe other people can correct me, I haven't found any records of ongoing land ownership, very few businesses, any of that, all of which happened in those other areas. But that didn't mean, just because it was different, didn't mean that they weren't building community, because they were. And I think there are three important factors about where they built community. And again, Pratam alluded to this. One was the bunkhouses that they lived in. As he noted, there were communal kitchens. The men hired one man that they paid the same wages as you would make if you were working in the mill to make sure that people had healthy, familiar food to come home to. In these bunkhouses too, it was also in other areas, not just Astoria, they could use one another's skills to the benefit of the community. So for example, very few people were literate. Very few people spoke English. But in a bunkhouse community, they could bridge those gaps. So people who could read to other people. This is part of the way that they could blend the news of home and the nationalist struggles that were going on, read the newspapers from British Columbia, where there was a lot of political awakening going on. And they also carried out, religious services together and practiced in those ways too. So bunkhouses were a really important part of the community. The other, again, is sports, and I'd love to get that citizenship paper. Sports, wrestling was a traditional sport out of India. People, like anybody who travels, you bring your cultural traditions with you. And sports was one of the ways that Indians were able to interface with the dominant community and gain a measure of real respect as men and as competitors. And in fact, Doden Singh, this man on the right, the big picture, he had a match in Portland where he was heralded as the hometown hero from Astoria. And it wasn't just Indians that came all the way from Astoria to Portland to see this match. It was a lot of the whites from Astoria too, because he was the dude, man. He was the winner for the hometown champ. But politics, I think, is the most momentous and community formation that Indians made. And this was, I want to put it in context, because this was a time of major nationalist struggles all over the world. Mexican Revolution, the Irish Revolution, the Chinese, Japan had just, beat Russia in a war. And Indians worked amongst these people, amongst and with, both in labor but also in politics. It was also a time of great labor organizing, industrial workers of the world, socialists, and Indians were a part of those organizations too. But for Indians, their organizing started in St. John's. In March 1910, another anti-Hindu riot jumped off. And as I mentioned earlier, these labor, race, immigration stews and frictions were global and regional in their making. And no matter how much Oregon leaders wanted to stop racial violence in the state, in 1910 it was sort of like trying to go against gravity. There were major headlines all over the country aimed at Indians, and it was particularly sharp on the West Coast, all over the West Coast. And actually the uproar just numerically speaking, was pretty ludicrous. 1,700 migrants, Indian migrants, came into the country at a year when millions were entering the country. So basically, this national hoopla landed in St. John's in March of 1910, and a riot broke out there. Something like 200 people in the streets, pulling people out of their jobs, throwing them out of the windows of their apartments, second-story apartment buildings, trying to push them onto the streetcars to get them out of town. And you can also see this brief excerpt from the St. John's newspaper is one of the real crimes of Indians was having the audacity to take part in town, and in town life, i.e. to parade up and down in the public thoroughfares instead of staying in their place. But again, like anywhere, there. Unlike anywhere else in the West, rioters were prosecuted, and those trials unwound over the next 2 years. Indians were critical in pushing for the involvement of the British Council and Portland judicial authorities, and most significantly, in the spring of 1912, nearly simultaneous to the close of the last of the St. John's riot trials, they organized a new group called the Pacific Coast Hindi Association and elected Sohan Singh Bhakna, Kanchi Ron, and I don't have a picture of Kumar, I'm afraid, sorry, as their leaders. And they became the organizing nucleus for Gother, which was a global radical independence movement formally launched downriver in Astoria in Oregon in 1913. These are the meeting sites where they met before that big meeting in Astoria. From North America, Gother gathered recruits from across the world, sought the overthrow of British colonial rule in India, and with the outbreak of World War I, several thousand recruits returned to India with that intent. And many of those came from Oregon, and I think that's a major reason why the Indian community is a discontinuous community in the state. But Gother was not the only opposition that arose here in Oregon. Bhagat Singh Tin arrived in Oregon shortly after Gother was formed. He lived among and befriended many of its activists. He also seemingly advocated some of Gother's views, especially about the inequality of Indians in their homeland. He, however, took a profoundly different path to resolving Indians' lack of citizenship and global standing. While Gotherites left to fight the English while the English were embroiled in World War I, Bhagat Singh Tin enlisted in the American war effort, as did others. This is one of the magazines operating in the U.S. at the time, promoting enlistment of Indians in the U.S. war effort. Here's some of the statistics from India itself in terms of the number of Indians that fought in the European theater on behalf of the British. Bhagat Singh Tin also believed that American racialized citizenship included him, as many others hoped that it did too. But in 1923, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a case that emanated from Oregon and went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, disagreed with Mr. Thend and set operative law for decades that Indians could not become American citizens. They were the wrong race. So neither Gother nor Tin's goals were met until World War II, when India ended colonial rule and prescriptions on Indian and Asian citizenship were reversed. Both of those things were undoubtedly shaped and motivated by people's struggles, including the Gotherites and Tin, but also by the changing needs of empires in the wake of World War II. But I want to close with bringing it back to why is this momentous history so little known? It could be argued in part that it was because it was a small and short-lived community in Oregon. I think it's also because Indian left in droves with World War I. But most importantly, I think we need to see their disremembering, which is what it is, because they were not unknown in their time. We have disremembered them. That's a legacy of white supremacy, which doesn't erase events that happens, but it shapes our narratives and our archives in its own image. Thank you so much.
Joanna, do you have a title for the book that's coming out next year?
Maybe.
Pardon?
Where hope and history meet.
History meets?
Where hope and history meet.
Oh, where hope and history meets. I thought you said we are hoping. Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Steve Williamson. And Steve came to Oregon in 1975 from Louisiana. He did extensive research on Opal Whiteley, and I don't know if any of you saw, but I've seen it actually a number of times on OPB, a program on Opal Whiteley, and Steve was involved in that, and I just got to meet him today. Okay. He has done the research on Opal Whiteley, and in the process came across stories of the early Asians who settled in the Mohawk Valley outside of Eugene. And this changed, if this is correct, this changed the trajectory of his research and has become a part of his overall work. Okay, thank you, Steve.
Thank you. It is going to be tough to follow these other two presenters because you guys did really good talks. Let me. But one thing, one thing she left out was for about the past 18 or so years, I've been the chair of the Oregon Asian Celebrations annual heritage exhibit. And has anybody here been to the Asian celebration in Eugene? All right, great. Part of my purpose today is to encourage the rest of you to come because it is like something you have never seen before. We get about 30,000 people in 2 days. It's at the fairgrounds. It's all indoors. You should come down and display your pictures. And it is a kaleidoscope of all the cultures of Asia. Now, the Heritage exhibit doesn't celebrate the cultures back in Asia. What we celebrate and try to make history entertaining are the immigrants, the Asian immigrants, once they got to Oregon or the Western United States. And we've had a number of authors over the years. I mean, we've had stories about the exhibit is about a third the size of this room, and we've had stories on men massacred for gold, Chinese massacred for gold in Eastern Oregon. My big story about the Pingyang school near Eugene that was blown up. And here at the lower, okay. They told us we were going to have about 15 minutes. So in the 15 minutes with my talk, these are the things I hope to do. Tell you about the Sikhs that lived in the Mohawk Valley. And also, I'm sure that among you, there are some people who do family research and maybe research on your own culture. I really strongly encourage you to do that and then turn it in, to give it to local historical societies. If you know of someone who lived in Brownsville or Astoria or Cottage Grove, send those historical societies the information. They will love to have it. All of the county historical societies would love to have this information now. Because most historical societies, and there's an element of racism too, but I think there's a common human thing where we tend to collect and save pictures and things about our own family and the people surrounding them. And so local historical societies run by volunteers, they just didn't, they didn't save pictures of early Asians in Lane County. This is me as a Gandhi dancer in 1975. And this is a railroad hammer like the one that I used. And I came up to Oregon to work on railroads, and I was going to go back. The other thing I want to toss out is, I just thought about putting this in, but I want to get you to think about the idea of like fate or a calling, because I assure you, I'm the least likely person to be standing up here talking about Asian immigration, and or to have been involved with the Asian celebration, because back 25 years ago, I knew next to nothing about Asia. I like to tell people that about all I knew was what I'd learned in Bruce Lee movies. And then I started researching the writer Opal Whiteley. And she had a best-selling book when she was 21. She grew up in Cottage Grove. And the University of Oregon hired me and put me on as a courtesy appointment. And of all things, I was in the Center for Advanced Technology in Education. And my office was filled with all of these old-smelling things like horses' bridle bits and farm tools and historic. But they did a great thing, and yep, there's me up in the top. Whoops, right. And they had me researching the organ writer Opal Whiteley, and you can find all through here, I've got my web pages, Asian Organ and Stories by Steve, and they link to stories about her, because this is the most unique, interesting mystery you will ever encounter. I've been working on it over a quarter century, and I'm not finished with it yet. That's my book that I hope to publish next year. And she actually went and visited India when she was in her early 20s, and she was the guest of the Maharana of Udaipur. And there he is there. She spent about a year there, took hundreds of pictures, and it's probably an overused phrase, but went where no white woman had gone before. But she did take hundreds of pictures and wrote these 3 articles for the Queen magazine that were published in 1929. But when I was interested, where I started with this was she had grown up, or she had lived for a short time in this little town called Marcola, which is about 15 miles northeast of Eugene. And this area here is what's called the Mohawk Valley, named after the Mohawk Valley in New York State. And here's Crawfordsville, Brownsville, Mohawk. And Opal Whiteley had lived out there for 9 months when she was 3 or 4 years old. It didn't seem like that prospective of a place to go and dig for unknown Opal Whiteley information. And then I met this man here. I met him in a graveyard. I was there cleaning up a grave that was part of the Whiteley family, and he was walking around. And if you've ever been around graveyards, you don't really stop and talk, engage people in conversations. But everybody's there to remember, a loved one they've lost. But I saw him moving around the graveyard, and this is where the idea of fate enters into, or fate, or getting a kick in the butt by divine providence, or your bad luck, or something. But I knew that I had to talk to him. I had an impulse, and maybe y'all have had this, that you have just gotta go see that person. You're gonna miss something really important if you don't. So I found a way. I engaged him in conversation. And he told me that he lived in Marcola. And I said, well, I've been hoping to meet someone who knew the history of Marcola a little bit. Do you know anybody that lives out there? And he said, well, I've got about 10,000 photographs of the Mohawk Valley. Do you want to come see them? That night, I was out at his house till after midnight. He fell asleep in the chair. And right about midnight, I turned up this story here called about the Pyongyang school bombing in 1901. And the story says this is the 3rd time this school has been blown up. And when I saw this story, I knew that it was too important. I knew it hadn't been reported on before, and it was too important. So that led to an association with Mr. Irish, where we're digging up information on the schoolhouse. I'm just going to flip through these real quick. It was about as racist as you can possibly get. You've heard of the Boxer Rebellion in China? This fella, Joe Huddleston, reversed the Boxer Rebellion and moved it to Oregon, where the Oregonians, we were the Boxers, kicking out all the foreigners. And he is supposed to, he called their opponents highbinders. It was mostly Japanese in the area, and that was a slur term for the way some Japanese men wore their hair. And this artist, if you're interested in art, you might know the name Maud Kern. She's quite famous around the University of Oregon and very famous in bringing Asian art to the United States. She was a teacher at the Pyongyang school right before it was blown up the final time. They always did it at night or on a weekend. Nobody was ever injured. But I have this great story about this one teacher. Just imagine being a teacher having to do this. They put a bomb underneath the floor. boom, blew a hole in the floor. And so she's having to tiptoe around this hole in the floor made by a bomb to teach her students. And some of those students' parents are in the group that put that bomb down there. That's a heck of a way to start. That was probably her first teaching job. Heck of a way to start your. No wonder she went towards college teaching instead. Heck of a way. But anytime you have bad people, I really believe, or I want to believe, you have good people who rise to oppose them, like we have to. And here is, you can read this story of the Hayden family on my website, asianoregon.org. It is the most remarkable story of a true friendship between two Japanese men who lived at their property. And this is their address this is his address in Japan. And he and Charlie Hayden kept in touch till World War II, and then after he lived in Hiroshima, so presumably died in the atomic blast. And another man. They were teaching people English using King James Bibles. So he wrote on the back of this card with this picture, "Thy is so good," which I just love that. But also in the Mohawk Valley, I turned up these pictures, and Joanna, anybody can tell you how rare pictures of Sikhs and Asians are. So the next photographs, these came from just a few miles above Marcola, a place called Crawfordsville. There was a Kalapuya Lumber Company and a Coast Range Lumber Company. Now, this historian said that quite a number of Hindus and Arabs worked at this mill. Now, when I really checked into it, there weren't people of the Hindu faith. They were Sikhs, and they weren't Arabs. They just wore turbans. But, then like now, the vast majority of Americans and Oregonians, if they see a man in a turban, that's an Arab or a Muslim. They see a person from India, that's a Hindu. They just really didn't know very much. This man, Hubert Banta, his grandson is the district attorney down in Douglas County, I think now. His father had the pictures, and Curtis Irish, who became my mentor and teacher, he got them from the Banta family, but we were able to find more information. Here's this picture Britton showed about the rail crew working on the railroad line. And that picture I showed you with me on the railroad track, that's taken less a quarter mile maybe from where this picture was. And I've had a few times at the Asian celebration, somebody come over and I'd say, well, here's a picture of them doing railroad construction. And I get this, grandpa, great-grandpa worked on a railroad, yeah. And I like to keep a railroad hammer around. So, and I'll invite you, just come around here and just pick this up. And then imagine swinging it 500, 700 times a day. And I guarantee you that is hard labor. There was one instance of Japanese and African-American workers. They built the railroad from Springfield to up the Mohawk Valley, and they didn't get paid, and they were just dumped out in the middle of the woods in 1901. Eventually, they did get paid, but they were just abandoned out there, and that really grabbed me when I found that newspaper article in Curtis Irish's collection, because I knew how hard they had worked. And if you've ever done that kind of labor, it's tough for you to not see somebody else get their pay. And this is the wonderful picture of a man with his bike. Here I say about 1909 up in Crawfordsville. And these pictures, this man here looks like one of the men in a picture that you have in your slideshow. And I have no idea what any of these men, but this man right there, just imagine his eyes. you know, people didn't get many chances like we have with our modern cell phones to take 30 pictures and select the right one. So, yeah, but he looks very much like it. And this is a story that I love, and it came from the Brownsville Times, and I found 3 or 4 really progressive that you wouldn't, articles in the Brownsville Times that you just wouldn't think a small town newspaper in rural Oregon would write. This is about the accident at the mill where Sundar Singh, a Hindu worker at the company, he got severely injured with his head, but it calls him a poor fellow, and it really is a very sympathetic article. So not, you know, like I say, in the middle of all these bad people, you always find good people, and the editor, I think, of the Brownsville Times was really one because of other stories that he wrote about other minorities. Now, another place in the Mohawk Valley that Sikhs were was in Mabel, Oregon. I don't have any photographs. I got photographs of Japanese from there, but not the Sikhs. But a good historian has documented. Well, he thought they were Hindus and Arabs, but they were Sikhs. Now, at the time, this little community only had about 200 people. This is the picture of the lumber mill. Now, the interesting thing about it is owned by the Dollar Steamship Line. And if you had an ancestor that came here from Asia, chances are they came on the Dollar Steamship Line. Robert Dollar had a brilliant closed-loop system where his ships brought workers from Asia. Many times they worked in mills that he had a financial interest in. They cut lumber and sent it back overseas on his ships again. And when those workers returned to India or Japan, they rode back on Robert Dollar's steamships. Brilliant closed loop. Now, this is another, I like this picture because it gives you an idea of the difficulty and skill of the work that men did, even when you call it manual labor. This is a railroad bridge. At the time, it was one of the largest. It's 176 feet tall. Imagine building it, and 800 feet long. Burned twice and just about bankrupted the company. All 3 of us have something about this man, Bhagat Singh Thind. And really, if they're this, and I've advocated for it in the Eugene School District, this man should be taught to all the Oregon's kids. His story is so inspiring. He immigrated here in 1913, paid his tuition through school at Berkeley by working in lumber mills. And that is amazing. He gets a PhD from Berkeley while he's working in lumber mills. A World War I vet. Over here I have, and one of the things we've asked in presentations at the Asian celebrations, why wouldn't we let this man be a U.S. citizen? You learn about him. What country wouldn't want this fella? I mean, and especially historically throughout history, one of the ways you get to be considered for citizenship is if you fight for another country's flag. And so to me, that these veterans of World War I were turned down for citizenship is just a real crime. He actually made the case that he was Caucasian and he should have been accepted. The judge made this kind of famous remark, a Supreme Court judge, just because you're Caucasian doesn't mean you're white. So, and he wrote, his son, this is him in his World War I uniform. His son, David Thind, came out to Oregon, 15 years ago, 10 years ago. One of the great adventures of my life was us going to Astoria and finding the places like Hindu Alley, finding the places where his father had lived. And at that time, Astoria just vaguely had a few old newspaper articles. And since they've realized that Astoria is really important in Sikh history because a lot of the people who wanted to rebel against Britain met up in Astoria and started planning it there. David Thind told me that one of the reasons his father wanted to come here and others was that they had learned about Washington and Jefferson and the American Revolution, and they figured, hey, we want to throw out the British. These folks did. And these are 2 pictures of him as an older man. I just love the look. He had wonderful eyes. but also coming up finally to this. I really encourage people to start looking up your own culture. You can. Places like Ancestry.com or newspapers.com, they cost money to join. There's a phenomenal amount of information in there, but they do cost money. This is free. Most of the Oregon newspapers, except the Brownsville Times for some reason, most of the old Oregon newspapers are online now, and they're free. And you can search this is the Dalles Chronicle. You can search for names and places, find out what was going on in the area that somebody lived in. They have the search engine is pretty good, and it's free. And you find you have to. Although I got to warn when you're looking for the old newspapers or searching, you've got to search by the old racist slur terms. They didn't use politically correct language 100 years ago. They used, sometimes, just the N-word just all the time. It was, so you search for what would, or different spellings, like some Americans spelled Hindu with two O's. So look for the off spellings. But this is so much fun, and you meet such interesting, neat people. I just want to close. This is 1924. The Ku Klux Klan, when they came to they had been in Marcola, Oregon for some time, and this particularly talks about the problem as the Klan saw it of foreign workers They were particularly after Japanese and Greeks at this point in 1925. And every town had their Ku Klux Klan rallies. They were social events, business events. And again, I really want to invite y'all to the Asian celebration, which will be coming up February 15th and 16th. It's in Eugene, and I guarantee you have never seen, if you haven't been, you've never seen anything like it. We have one room that half of it is all food from all over Asia. The other half is continuous martial arts demonstrations. Martial arts groups from all over Oregon send their students there, and they have little girls flipping grown men, and it's just a great fun thing. One room that's mostly real fine art, really nice art. And then the marketplace, which is a gigantic room at the fairgrounds, and that's where the heritage exhibit is. And we get about 25 to 30,000 people in 2 days. And so I guarantee you it's worth the drive. You could spend all day there and not see everything. So I think that's about it for my thing. And now,
Thank you.
thank you.